There are forests that inspire awe, forests that invite peace, and forests that feel alive with natural beauty. But Hoia Baciu is none of these things. To those who live near the edges of Cluj-Napoca, this place is not just avoided, it is feared. The air that lingers around its crooked trees feels thick, as if time itself has slowed within its borders. Even in daylight, when the sun pierces the canopy, there is a peculiar weight pressing down, a silence so unnatural that even birds and insects abandon the place. The villagers have learned to read this silence as one reads an omen, an unspoken warning that something beyond human understanding prowls among the twisted oaks and skeletal branches. The whisper of lights that drift between the trunks, orbs that glow with a sickly, pulsating radiance. Travelers who followed these lights never returned, as if swallowed by the forest itself. Some claim to hear voices calling their names from just beyond the shadows, familiar voices of loved ones, long gone. Others recount the stench of sulfur, the chilling touch of cold hands brushing against their skin, though no one stood near. Children, when asked, speak of shapes in the tree, shapes that smile when no one else is watching. The elders say the land is cursed, a place where ancient rituals once opened doors that were never meant to be opened, and where something still lingers, restless, feeding on the lost. Most terrifying of all is the clearing at the forest's center, a barren circle where no vegetation dares to grow. The soil is dry, ashen, as if scorched by fire centuries ago, though no flame has touched it in living memory. Compasses spin wildly there, metal equipment fails, and those who stand too long often faint, overwhelmed by dizziness and nausea. Local hunters swear they hear drumbeats rising from beneath the earth itself, muffled and distant, yet steady, as though something buried alive still beats to be set free. It is here that the stories of vanishing hikers and cursed wanderers intertwine. People have entered Hoia Baciu and emerged hours later believing days had passed, or worse, returned years later without having aged a single day. And then there are those who never return at all. Their absence, leaving behind only broken families and the faint echo of their last screams carried by the wind. These tales, whispered generation after generation, have built a fortress of fear around the forest, one stronger than any wall of stone. And still, despite the fear, there are always those drawn to its heart, lured by curiosity, by defiance, or by the quiet call of the forest itself, the whispers that rise when the sun begins to set. Night had already begun to stretch its long shadows. When the group of researchers arrived at the forest's edge, they came armed not with weapons, but with curiosity, ambition, and equipment: cameras, with night vision, audio recorders, electromagnetic sensors. To them, Hoia Baciu was not a place to fear, but an opportunity to unravel one of Europe's most enduring mysteries. They laughed nervously as they unpacked, trying to mask the unease that crept into their voices. For even from the outside, the forest loomed like a living entity, its dark canopy rising against the blood-red sky of the setting sun. Each tree looked warped and tortured, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, as if they were recoiling from some unseen presence deep within. The locals had warned them, voices low and eyes darting toward the ground, not to enter at night. But warnings only fueled their determination. They wanted proof, tangible evidence that the stories of orbs, voices, and vanishings were not mere folklore. And so, with the first click of their flashlights, they crossed the boundary into the forest. The change was immediate. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, as though they had stepped into a vacuum where even the wind feared to move. Every crunch of leaves beneath their boots seemed amplified, echoing back at them like mockery. The silence pressed hard against their ears, leaving them with the eerie sensation that the forest was listening, waiting. A single crow cawed in the distance, its cry sharp and sudden, but when they turned to locate it, there was nothing, only twisted trees and impenetrable dark. The path they followed was narrow, almost suffocating. Branches clawed at their jackets, tangling in their hair, pulling them back as if warning them to turn away. One of the researchers, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, swore she saw figures between the trees, pale and fleeting, vanishing the moment her flashlight caught them. Another claimed he heard whispering, soft at first, but growing clearer voices speaking his name, though none of his companions had uttered a word. Still, they pushed forward, deeper and deeper, guided by the stories of a barren clearing hidden in the forest's heart. That was where the legends said the veil was thinnest, where the earth itself seemed scarred by rituals long forgotten. The anticipation grew heavier with every step. until the forest opened abruptly into silence and space. Before them lay the clearing, a perfect circle carved into the land, like an open wound. No trees, no grass, no sign of life, only barren soil marked with faint, blackened patterns, as though fire had licked across it again and again. They stood in silence, awe mixing with dread. Their compasses spun erratically, and their equipment began to malfunction, screens flashing static. The air smelled of ash, though no smoke rose. The woman whispered under her breath, almost involuntarily, "This is not just a clearing, it's an altar." And in that moment, even the bravest of them felt it, the undeniable truth that they were trespassers on forbidden ground, standing in a place where men were never meant to stand. As the group began setting up their fragile equipment in the center of the barren clearing, an unsettling vibration trembled beneath their boots, so faint at first that they mistook it for imagination. But when their tripods rattled, and the soil shifted like something breathing just beneath the surface, fear settled into their bones. One of them cursed under his breath, checking the camera mounted on its stand. It flickered once, twice, then collapsed into static. Another tried his recorder, only to hear a violent crackling, like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. Within minutes, every piece of technology they had brought to validate their journey failed them, leaving only the harsh glow of their flashlights and the pounding rhythm of their hearts. Then, from the tree line, a sound broke the silence. At first, it seemed like the low hum of wind, but there was no breeze. It deepened, grew, became rhythmic, a chant, low, guttural, layered in tones that felt more like vibration in their bones than words in the air. They turned their lights toward the source, but the beams illuminated only the warped trees, their shadows tangled like claws. Yet the sound persisted, rising, echoing from all directions at once, until it felt as though the very forest itself was chanting. The soil beneath the clearing cracked with a muffled hiss, releasing a stench that burned their nostrils, rot sulfur, the unmistakable stench of decay. One of the researchers stumbled back, gagging, while another froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand as the beam caught movement between the trees. Shadows shifted, gliding unnaturally, defying the light that sought to pin them down. They were too fluid, too alive, to be tricks of the imagination. Panic began to stir in their group, but no one dared speak above the relentless chant. The clearing seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, drawing them closer to its heart, even as every instinct screamed to run. And then they realized the most terrifying truth of all. The rituals were not relics of forgotten times. They were not echoes of the past. They were happening now, around them. Figures emerged from the tree line, slowly at first, then in pairs, then in groups, until the clearing swarmed with hooded shapes cloaked in black, faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the unnatural light of their torches. Those flames were wrong, burning not gold or red but a sickly green, their glow twisting across the trees and staining the soil with eerie illumination. The figures moved in precise formation, forming a perfect circle around the group. Their chants merged into one rising drone, so loud and resonant it rattled the researchers' bones. One of them whispered, voice cracking, "We need to leave, now." But the forest was no longer their ally. The circle had closed. The path behind them swallowed in darkness deeper than night, and before them, in the very center of the clearing, the cracked soil split wider. A single, violent pulse shook the earth, like a drumbeat from beneath, a heartbeat that did not belong to anything human. They were no longer outsiders, observing a mystery. They had become participants in a ritual that was never meant to be witnessed, much less interrupted. The circle of fire had been formed, and its flames demanded more than light, they demanded sacrifice. The researchers stood frozen, their breaths shallow and ragged, as the circle of hooded figures pressed closer. The green flames of the torches licked at the night, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the warped trees. For a fleeting moment, the outsiders hoped these were pranksters, eccentric villagers, perhaps trying to frighten them away. But that fragile hope shattered when the chanting deepened, its resonance not merely sound but vibration, thrumming through the marrow of their bones. This was not theater, this was devotion. Each figure wore a mask carved from bone, polished smooth by time yet etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Some masks were shaped like snarling beasts, others like twisted skulls, but all carried an expression of unholy reverence. The air around them thickened, oppressive, as though the clearing itself had been sealed off from the rest of the world. One of the researchers, his voice trembling, tried to demand an explanation, but his words crumbled into the chanting, his human tongue powerless. Against that relentless tide, the leader stepped forward, distinct from the others. His mask was elongated, its features sharp, almost serpentine, with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. He held a curved dagger, its blade blackened and etched with runes that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The group instinctively recoiled, their flashlights quivering in unsteady hands, but the forest betrayed them. The trees shifted in subtle, horrifying ways, branches arched inward like the bars of a cage, sealing them inside the circle. Every potential escape was swallowed by darkness so absolute, it seemed to consume the beams of their lights. The hooded figures began to move as one, stepping in rhythm, stomping against the earth in perfect unison. The sound reverberated through the clearing like a heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing the tremors in the soil. The researchers could feel the ground vibrating beneath their boots, the air vibrating within their lungs. Panic clawed at their chests as realization dawned. They were not witnesses to a ceremony, they were offerings trapped within it. The leader's hollow eyes fixed on them, and though no words were spoken, a command seemed to pass silently through the circle. The chant shifted, rising to a crescendo, carrying a tone that was less prayer and more invocation. From the tree line, shadows thickened, gathering unnaturally, curling toward the hooded figures like smoke feeding a fire. The flames of the torches bent inward, their green light intensifying, spilling grotesque reflections across the masks. And in those fleeting glimpses, the researchers thought they saw more than wood and bone faces beneath the masks. Gaunt and pale, stretched unnaturally tight across skulls, lips twisted into smiles that did not belong to the living. One of the women in the group let out a scream, a raw, piercing sound that fractured the rhythm for a brief second. The cult did not flinch. Instead, they quickened their steps, circling faster, stamping harder, until the ground itself shook with their ritual. The leader raised his dagger high, its runes glowing brighter, as if answering the chants. The circle was no longer simply human, it had become a living conduit, channeling something vast and ancient, something that reached out from beneath the soil. And as the green flames roared higher, licking at the sky, the researchers realized with soul-crushing certainty they had stepped into the jaws of a ritual that had been fed by centuries of blood, and tonight it demanded theirs. The leader's dagger gleamed faintly in the unnatural torchlight, the curved blade alive with those pulsing runes. The chanting swelled, louder and louder, until it seemed to drown out even the sound of their own racing heartbeats. One of the researchers, a man in his 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that had earlier carried authority, tried to reason with the masked figures. His words cracked with terror. "We don't mean harm, please," but his plea dissolved into the overwhelming drone of voices, swallowed before it could find air. In a single fluid motion, the leader reached out and seized him, dragging him to the barren soil at the very center of the clearing. The others screamed, lunging forward, but the cultists formed a wall, pressing closer with their torches raised, green flames flaring as if fed by the cries of the desperate. Their movements were synchronized, terrifying in their precision, as though they had performed this ritual countless times before. The man fell to his knees, his flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling into the dirt, its weak beam illuminating the jagged cracks in the soil. His glasses slid crooked down his face, eyes wide, brimming with frantic tears. "No, no, please," he begged, but the leader pressed him down with an unnatural strength that betrayed any notion of humanity. The dagger rose high, its edge glinting like the eye of a predator catching the moonlight. The circle erupted in stops, rhythmic and deafening, the ground shaking in time with their chant. The sound was primal, ancient, as if calling something buried beneath to awaken. The air itself seemed to constrict, thick with sulfur and ash, pressing down on the lungs of those who watched. The leader tilted his head back and uttered a single, guttural word that none of the outsiders could comprehend, and then the dagger plunged. A scream ripped through the night, raw and shrill, echoing beyond the forest's edge like a wounded animal's final cry. It cut off abruptly, swallowed by the earth as the soil darkened beneath the victim, drinking greedily of his blood. The torches flared higher, their flames roaring skyward, staining the trees with an emerald glow. The chanting shifted again, softer now, almost reverent, as if the offering had appeased something vast and unseen. The surviving researchers clutched at one another, paralyzed between the urge to flee and the terror of breaking the circle. One woman sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with silent convulsions, while another man's lips moved soundlessly in prayer, though no god seemed willing to hear him in this cursed place. The leader withdrew his dagger, the runes now glowing brighter than ever, slick with crimson that steamed as it touched the cold night air. He lifted the blade high above his head, displaying it to the unseen darkness, as though presenting proof of devotion. The cultists bowed low in unison, their voices dipping into whispers, murmuring praises to whatever watched from beneath the earth. And in that awful moment, the survivors realized the horror of their situation in full. This was not the climax of the ritual, it was only the beginning. The blood had opened the way, and now something else, something monstrous, stirred in the depths below, eager to rise. The ground trembled as if the earth itself had grown restless from the blood it had just consumed. Dust rose from the cracked soil, swirling unnaturally in the torchlight, carried not by wind but by something deeper, something exhaling from beneath the earth. The researchers clung to each other, their breaths ragged, their minds fraying under the crushing realization that the ritual was far from over. The blood was not the end, it was the invitation. A low hum began to spread across the clearing, vibrating in their bones, a sound too deep to be natural. It was as though the very core of the world had spoken, a voice that could not be heard with ears but felt inside the skull, rattling their sanity loose. One of the survivors collapsed, clutching her temples, screaming that the voices were inside her head. The cultists did not move to help her. They only bowed lower, their green flames bending toward the ground as if worshipping the cracked soil. From that fissure, a hand emerged, but it was no human hand. It was black as coal, dripping with a thick tar-like substance that hissed as it hit the ground. The fingers were unnaturally long, clawed at the tips, scraping across the dirt with a shriek like nails on glass. The leader fell to his knees, pressing his masked face against the earth, dagger extended as an offering. The chanting reached a fever pitch, rising and falling in waves that echoed across the forest, like thunder rolling over mountains. Then, a shape began to climb from the soiler torso, shifting and writhing as though it were made of smoke and flesh, woven together. Its form was unstable, constantly changing, yet its eyes remained fixed, twin orbs of burning red that pierced the clearing like twin suns of blood. The temperature plummeted, frost blooming across the ground, clinging to the trees, coating the masks of the worshippers in a thin sheen of ice. Each breath the researchers took burned their lungs as if inhaling shards of glass. The entity loomed higher, a figure both monstrous and incomprehensible, its body twisting like liquid shadow. When it opened its mouth, no sound came, only a wave of despair that washed over the clearing, dropping one of the researchers to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Another clawed at his own throat, choking on screams that never found release. The cultists remained unshaken, swaying in their trance, their devotion absolute. The leader raised his dagger, now glowing with blinding intensity, and pressed its edge against his own palm. Without hesitation, he sliced it open, letting his blood drip onto the soil. The entity shuddered in response, its red eyes blazing brighter. A voice thundered through the clearing, neither human nor animal but something older, something vast, vibrating through marrow and memory alike. It spoke no words, yet its intent was unmistakable. Hunger. The woman who had collapsed earlier screamed again, louder this time, her body twisting as though invisible hands clawed at her from within. Her cries rose above the chanting for only a moment before cutting short, silenced as her body went limp. The shadowed figure turned its burning eyes toward the survivors, and in that gaze they felt the crushing knowledge that they were next. What had been summoned was no spirit to be dismissed, no illusion to be forgotten. It was an entity bound to the soil of Hoia Baciu, fed by centuries of blood. And now it was awake once more. Panic detonated in the group like a spark in dry tinder. The moment the monstrous figure's burning eyes swept over them, survival instinct tore through their paralysis. One of the researchers shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, "Run!" And just like that, the circle of order collapsed into chaos. Flashlights swung wildly as they bolted toward the tree line, their boots pounding against the frozen soil. But Hoia Baciu was not a forest that allowed escape. Almost immediately, the trees seemed to twist and shift, their bent trunks angling inward to funnel them back into darkness. Branches snagged their jackets and tangled in their hair like skeletal hands, clawing at them with malicious intent. The path that should have led back toward the village was gone, replaced by corridors of shadow that looped and bent in impossible ways. Each turn dragged them deeper, farther from salvation, as if the forest itself was alive and reshaping to trap them. Their breaths came ragged, visible clouds in the frigid air. Behind them, the chanting continued, steady and resonant, echoing through the woods, though the cultists themselves could no longer be seen. Worse than the voices of the hooded figures were the whispers that now accompanied them, soft, intimate, too close to be ignored. The whispers spoke their names with chilling familiarity, voices that belonged to dead relatives, lost lovers, childhood friends. Every call felt like a hook dragging at their minds, pulling them to look over their shoulders, to hesitate, to falter. One of the men did falter. He spun, flashlight shaking, convinced he had heard his mother's voice calling to him. His scream tore through the group as something unseen yanked him sideways into the dark. They caught only a glimpse of blur of motion, a shadow darker than shadow itself, and then he was gone, his cries muffled as though swallowed by the trees. The survivors stumbled on, terror clawing at their lungs. Their lights flickered, their batteries dying one by one, as if drained by the forest's hunger. The woman in front collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, refusing to move. When one of her companions tried to drag her up, the ground beneath her split with a violent crack, swallowing her in a sudden eruption of dirt and frost. Her screams echoed once, then silence reclaimed the night. By now, the forest felt endless. No matter how far they ran, they circled back to the same warped trees, the same impossible clearings, the same stench of rot that grew stronger with every passing second. Shadows darted across their vision, faster than human eyes could track, always at the edges, never fully seen yet undeniable in presence. One researcher swore he felt fingers brush the back of his neck, icy and thin. Another stumbled as something invisible shoved him hard enough to nearly snap his ankle. They pressed on in blind desperation, stumbling over roots, scraping their hands raw on bark, their flashlights barely piercing the dark. The forest had transformed into a labyrinth built from nightmares, every turn a dead end, every path a circle that led back toward the clearing they so desperately fled. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out even the frantic sound of their own heartbeats. By the time they realized the awful truth, it was too late. They had not escaped the ritual. The forest had only played with them, herding them like prey. Ahead, through the mist and twisted branches, the faint glow of green flames reappeared. The chanting thundered once more. They had run in terror, but the jaws of the ritual had never let them go. The surviving researcher, his clothes torn, face pale with exhaustions, tumbled into a shallow ditch at the forest's edge of the clearing. His chest heaved, lungs burning with each breath, as if the very air in Hoia Baciu was poison. His trembling hands clutched the battered camera, the only piece of equipment that still sputtered faint signs of life. The lens was cracked, its focus skewed, but it was enough. He pressed the record button with bloodied fingers, desperate to leave behind a testimony, even if it became his last. The screen lit his gaunt face in ghostly light. Sweat and dirt streaked down his cheeks, mixing with tears he hadn't realized were falling. His voice, when it came, was ragged, hoarse from screaming. This place, this cursed forest, it doesn't let you leave. It doesn't let anyone leave. His words broke into trembling sobs, but he forced himself to continue, as though time itself was running out. If you find this, if you find me, turn back. Don't step into these trees. Don't listen to the whispers. They know your name. They'll use it against you. Behind him, the chanting still echoed faintly, like a heartbeat carried on the wind. He flinched every time it rose, jerking his head to the side as if expecting one of those hooded figures to emerge from the dark. He brought the camera closer, his wide, hollow eyes filling the frame. "We thought we were here to study legends," he whispered, "but the legends studied us. The cult isn't gone. The rituals never stopped. The entity," his words faltered, his mouth quivering as though speaking of it might summon its gaze again. "It wants blood. It always wants blood." The camera shook violently as he fell to his knees, overcome by the weight of despair. "They took them," he cried, rocking slightly. "My friends. I can still hear them. They scream, but it's not their screams anymore. It's something else wearing their voices." His confession blurred as tears splattered across the lens. His hands reached out toward the ground, showing streaks of soil already damp with what could only be blood. He leaned in closer, his lips almost touching the lens. "If my sister ever sees this, tell her I tried to come back. I tried, but the forest bends itself, reshapes itself. Every path leads back to the circle. It's alive. It feeds on us. For a few long seconds, he stared into the camera, his breathing shallow and uneven. Then his eyes widened suddenly, darting to the side. The green glow of torches flickered in the distance, moving closer, slow and deliberate. He whispered one final word, so soft it was almost inaudible. "Forgive me." The camera tipped sideways, showing only blurred soil and fragments of shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. The last sound it captured was his scream, sharp, cut short, and then silence, as if the forest had swallowed even that dot. When the authorities finally arrived, they found the group's van abandoned just beyond the tree line. Its headlights were still faintly glowing, drained, nearly dead, as if the vehicle had been waiting for someone to return. The doors were wide open, swinging gently in the cold wind, and inside lay a chaotic scatter of belongings: wallets, passports, jackets, half-eaten food. Everything a traveler would need for survival remained untouched. But of the researchers themselves, there was no trace. Officers searched the vehicle with caution, though many of them muttered under their breath that they already knew what they would rather wouldn't find. The locals who had warned the group to stay away now stood at a distance, refusing to set foot closer to the forest's edge. Their faces were grim, their silence louder than any explanation. For them, this was no mystery. It was simply Hoia Baciu taking what it was owed. Stranger still was the state of the equipment scattered in the back of the van. Cameras had been smashed violently, as though someone or something wanted to erase all evidence of what had happened. Hard drives were melted, their plastic warped, as though by unnatural fire, while audio recorders were cracked down the middle, their magnetic tape tangled like veins. One officer described it in his report as an intentional destruction, but without signs of human struggle. It was as if the devices themselves had turned against their owners, silencing their stories forever. Witnesses claimed that during the nights that followed, the van's headlights flickered back on by themselves, glowing faintly in the mist before shutting down again. Others swore they heard faint screams echoing from the forest when they walked the roads at dusk, screams that didn't sound entirely human. Weeks passed, but no bodies were ever recovered. Search teams with dogs combed the forest, but the animals refused to move past a certain point, whining and growling until handlers pulled them away. Drones sent overhead malfunctioned mid-flight, their GPS systems failing, their cameras glitching into static. Every effort to find evidence inside Hoia Baciu ended with failure or worse. Investigators returning pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak of what they had experienced. The official report concluded that the group had been lost in the woods, victims of disorientation and harsh terrain, but locals whispered otherwise. They said the clearing had claimed them, pulled them into its endless circle. Some even claimed to see them wandering the forest at night, silhouettes of familiar faces moving between the trees, flashlights swinging faintly, their beams swallowed before reaching the ground. To this day, the van remains etched into the memory of the village. For the people of Cluj-Napoca, it is not merely an abandoned vehicle. It is a marker, a grim reminder, a warning. They say the forest doesn't take everything at once. It leaves tokens behind, belongings, scraps, fragments just enough to lure the next curious soul deeper into its waiting jaws. And so the van sits in photographs, a hollow shell filled with silence, while the forest looms behind it like a predator crouched in patience. The researchers had not simply disappeared. They had been consumed, and Hoia Baciu, ever hungry, waited for the next offering. Even now, decades after countless vanishings, the reputation of Hoia Baciu Forest endures like a wound that refuses to close. Tourists still come, drawn by curiosity, skeptics with cameras slung over their shoulders, thrill seekers eager to test their courage. Some return, shaken but alive, whispering of strange lights and time lost in loops. Others never return at all, their absence added to the growing tally of names swallowed by the trees. Yet the locals, those who have lived in the shadow of the forest all their lives, know better. They warn in hushed tones, crossing themselves when the sun dips low. The rituals never ended, the cult never left, and the entity never sleeps. On certain nights when the moon hides behind thick clouds, a sickly green glow rises from the heart of the forest, flickering like phantom flames. Those who have dared to watch claim the torches burn in circles, moving in patterns too precise to be random. From miles away, faint chants can be heard, carried on the wind, low, guttural, rhythmic, not made for human throats. To the villagers, this sound is no mystery. It is the echo of the ritual, repeating endlessly, feeding the soil with devotion and fear alike. Legends say the cultists are no longer entirely human, their forms warped by centuries of worship, their souls bound to the entity they serve. Some believe they are the very shadows that slither through the trees, shifting between shapes, masquerading as loved ones to lure the unwary. Others believe they are the masks themselves, faces that pass from one host to another, worn until the flesh beneath rots away. Whatever the truth, one certainty remains: the forest always finds new voices to carry the chant. Paranormal investigators continue to document the strange phenomena: magnetic fields spiking without cause, photographs revealing human silhouettes where no one had stood, audio recorders capturing whispers calling out the names of those holding them. The barren clearing remains the forest's most infamous scar, a perfect circle where nothing grows, its soil still blackened and hostile to life. Scientists offer theories: radiation, soil contamination, psychological suggestion, but none can explain why compasses spin or why grown men collapse weeping after only minutes inside. For those who believe, the explanation is simpler. The clearing is an altar, and the rituals ensure it remains fed. Each torch, each chant, each drop of blood binds the entity further to this world. It is said that if the rituals ever ceased, the forest would fall silent, and silence, the villagers claim, would be far worse. Silence would mean the entity no longer needs offerings. Silence would mean it is free, so the forest continues its cycle, luring, feeding, devouring, and echoing. At the edges of Cluj-Napoca, parents still warn their children never to follow voices in the dark, no matter how familiar. Travelers are told to stay away after sunset, to ignore the glow of lights drifting through the trees. And yet, curiosity is stronger than fear for some. Each year, new footsteps crunch across the boundary, new cameras click in the dark, and new screams are swallowed before reaching the night sky. The echoes rise again and again, not fading but building, as if the forest itself is rehearsing for something greater. Those who listen too closely swear the chants are changing, forming words that sound almost familiar, as if they are learning the language of the living. Perhaps one day the forest will not need the cult to speak for it. Perhaps one day the forest will speak for itself, and when that day comes, the whispers of Hoia Baciu will not stay within the trees. They will spill outward, over villages, over cities, echoing endlessly, till the whole world is part of the ritual.